thank you for your attendance. My name is Eduardo Martí. I'm the president of the college, and I am delighted to see so many members of the community here to hear this very, very important lecture from a dear friend and a very important person in the City University. I don't know how many of you, members of the community, understand the transformation that is taking place in the City University. To make it into one sentence, what is really happening is that we are moving from a federation of 17 different colleges to one university with 17 campuses. And under the leadership of our Chancellor, Matthew Goldstein, the reputation of the City University and the ability to attract faculty and students to our university has enhanced 1,000%. The Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Louise Mirrer, is the architect, if you will, behind the scenes of the emphasis on academic excellence at our institution. She was the originator and creator of things like the Honors College that now boasts 350 students with the average SAT score of 1,300. I couldn't enter there. She is, in her own right, a scholar. She has 2 Ph.D.s from Stanford University and a bachelor from the University of Pennsylvania. She is an extensive writer. Her most recent book is Women, Jews, and Muslims in the Texts of the Reconquest of Castile. And I am privileged to tell you that I just came back from Granada in Spain, where I saw the Alhambra, and I think that I'm going to have a different perspective of this lecture when I hear it today. We are privileged to have with us the Executive Vice Chancellor for the City University of New York. But before I bring her over, I want to thank the originators, the helpers, the supporters, and the encouragers of this lecture. And first of all, Dr. Sheena Gillespie, who is a member, the chair, if you will, of the faculty, and a strong member of the committee on the presidential lectures. Dr. Peter Gray, Dr. Kenneth Perrell, and Vice President Robert Kahn. These individuals helped me create these lectures that are really dedicated in the fall to bring a distinguished lecturer from the City University, and in the spring, a distinguished lecturer from our own faculty. Now, we have yet to select the person for the spring, and as soon as it is selected, we will let you know if you have signed the book outside. So please sign that book so we can put you on a mailing list, and as soon as we have the spring lecture announced, we will send that to you. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Louise Mirrer, the Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs of the City University of New York.
I'd like to thank Dr. Martí not only for his very nice, very, very kind, exceedingly kind introduction, but also for all that he's doing for this university. I just have mentioned to him and to others that I saw from the Queensborough community that this campus has really been transformed under his leadership. It's an absolutely beautiful campus. The potential was always there, and he's really realizing that potential, and it's deeply appreciated across the university. Dr. Martí has very many fine colleagues. He has a terrific team, and I've really enjoyed working with them. And I've very, very many times come across the view that traditional Judaism blurs the distinction between the present and the past. The present, on the one hand, is perceived as an effort to achieve the ideals of the past, while the past is seen largely as a precursor of the present. I'm going to take this view very seriously in my remarks this afternoon because I want to be able to inform an important discussion around the Holocaust that's been taking place here at Queensborough Community College for a very long period of time. But my own particular expertise is in the literature and the lives of medieval Jews. I'm going to focus my remarks on a troubling, but very important topic. That is the recurrence of hostility and violence against the Jewish people. I'll look at the particular experience of Sephardic Jews, their violent expulsion from Spain in the 15th century, and their persecution by Hitler during World War II. To help explicate my subject, I'm going to draw on examples from history, from literature, and also from art. One source, which has for a very long time been of special interest to me, is a body of literature that's been perpetuated by Sephardic Jews wherever they fled oppression and certain death. For example, in the Ottoman Empire in North Africa, following the Spanish Inquisition, and in Los Angeles, London, and Israel in the 20th century. This literature is oral, and though many people have recorded it in writing, it most often has been passed along as song from generation to generation. I'd like to begin then by reciting one of these songs, which was composed by Mrs. Rachel Castellete in post-World War II London and written down by her in 1959. Mrs. Castellete, who is originally from Salonika, wrote in Ladino, or Judeo, the language of the Spanish Jews. I hope you'll indulge me as I read the song first in its original language, and then later in my own English translation. The song is called Cuando Vine en Londra, in English, When I Came to London. Yo cuando vine en Londra, vine muchacha por holidays. Topé a este muchacho y me casé con él. Tuve negro mazal, me dejó a la vejez. Desgraciadamente no viví ni a la mancebez. Le truje buena joie y muchas liras turcas. Las hice todas inglesas y no me aproveché de ellas. Vine en esta ciudad para pasar estas huertas guerras. Gracias a mi Dios, a mis hijos no me tocó. Si yo estaba en Salanik, Hitler, como mató a toda mi gente, me iba a matar y a mí. Hoy me topo en esta ciudad, mas estoy pasando miseria. Hoy me topo aquí, no me puedo mercar ni un bocadillo chico de vino o de raki. When I came to London, I came as a girl for holidays. I met this boy, and I married him. I had no mazal, that's a Sephardic pronunciation, mazel, as most people say, luck. He left me to grow old alone. Unhappily, he didn't even last through youth. I brought him a good dowry and many Turkish liras. I made them all English, but I was never able to get any advantage from them. I came to this city to pass the war years. Thanks to my God, the war didn't take my sons. If I had stayed in Salonika, Hitler, just as he killed all my people, would have killed me too. Today I find myself in this city, but I'm suffering greatly. Today I find myself here, but I can't even buy a little mouthful of wine or a fishbone. Mrs. Castellete's song is in many ways a metaphor for the experience of Sephardic Jews. The language in which it was composed, Ladino or Judeo, as I mentioned earlier, has its origins in medieval Spain, where Jews regularly interacted with Spanish-speaking Christian and Arabic-speaking Muslim neighbors. This Judeo-Spanish language tells the story of many years, in fact, many centuries, during which Jews were a vital and appreciated part of Spanish culture. And although one can surely find many instances of anti-Semitism during those years, Jews were able to occupy positions of importance, great importance, within the society, culturally and politically. This would all change in the waning years of the Middle Ages until the Jews were finally expelled from Spain in 1492. When the Jews left, they took with them the language they were accustomed to speaking, keeping it alive until the first half of the 20th century, and in some cases, even longer. For Spanish Jews who fled to the Ottoman Empire, the language, as well as medieval Spanish traditions, were supported by a decentralized system of government that allowed religious, cultural, and social autonomy. Administrative responsibility was left in the hands of different ethnic and religious groups that comprised the empire. And this enabled Sephardic Jews to enjoy religious and social liberty and to freely transmit the artifacts of the culture they brought with them from Spain. But anti-Semitism once again forced a violent dispersal of the community during World War II. As Mrs. Castellete points out in her song, she was indeed fortunate to have escaped Hitler, because the Jewish community of Salonika, once so vital and appreciated, was exterminated when the Germans occupied the city. Si yo estaba en Salanik, she says, if I had been in Salonika, she would have faced the same tragic fate as her fellow Jews. Mrs. Castellete wrote down a number of songs. A salient theme which comes across with the same sense of tragedy as many sung by her ancestors as they fled medieval Spain is the sad reality the Jews became, in many instances of political upheaval across the centuries, demonized, quite literally, as you can see from this medieval Spanish depiction above me, in which stereotyped Jewish and devilish features are collapsed. The miniature that you see above portrays a devil with the horns that were so often said to characterize Jewish physiognomy and a so-called Jewish nose. Once this economy of stereotype was achieved, it was easy to make of Jews a particular target of violence. I just want to say that the images I'm going to show you this afternoon are quite troubling, and I'm sure you will find them very unpleasant, but they make a point. They make the point that I need to make, which is that the kinds of stereotypes which have projected certain behaviors across the centuries originated in the Middle Ages, and they are not new with the 20th century. It was worse for the Jews. A los judíos fue más pasión, Mrs. Castellete writes in another song about the events of World War II, even though she says many people were affected. As the depiction that you're looking at might suggest, it was worse for the Jews in medieval Spain as well. I'd like to put forward the view that though the songs I've cited reflect Mrs. Castellete's experience in World War II and in post-World War II London, there's a certain consciousness in her words of her medieval Spanish past and of its place in her own present circumstances. Mrs. Castellete sings, as her ancestors did, of behaviors that seem forever to characterize the vicissitudes of human life. Her songs, I would argue, are a part of a complex dialogue of past and present, perpetuating through time and geographical space a sense of Jewish difference. Not the distinction that Jewish people might feel, for example, as a chosen people, but instead a difference imposed on them by others who found it expedient to ascribe to Jews a fabled aspect, motivating the popular conclusion that Jews are responsible for political and social ills. I'd like to spend some time talking about this, introducing first of all a bit of background, then looking at some examples that I've collected over time. As I said earlier, Jews were an important and vital part of Spanish cultural and political life for many centuries. As a religious group, Jews were firmly excluded from church and political offices, but their economic and their intellectual strengths often made them powerful players in the society. The best-known example of Jewish participation is the Toledan court of the 13th century Castilian king, Alfonso X. Here, Jews' interactions with Christians and also with Muslims were critical to the transmission of scientific learning and culture. Jewish collaboration in the translation of scientific treatises from Arabic to Spanish may even have affected, some argue, the development of the Spanish language. There are also examples of Jews who held important positions in the medieval court, including Samuel Halevi, treasurer to King Peter I of Castile. Halevi built a synagogue in Toledo in 1357, now known as El Tránsito. Some of you who have visited Toledo will surely have seen it. It's been beautifully restored. You might have noticed, if you've seen the synagogue, that Halevi dedicated its chapel to the Christian king Peter I. Even as late as the 15th century, high-ranking Jewish officials, such as the Jewish scholar and financier Isaac Abravanel and the court rabbi Abraham Senior, were able to occupy positions in the Castilian court. But in the waning years of the 14th century, a push to strictly limit the spaces the Jews could occupy, always, as I said earlier, part of the dynamic of medieval Spanish society, took hold in a different and markedly more virulent way. The first mass attacks on Jews, or pogrom in Spain, took place in Seville on the 6th of June in 1391. Next slide, please. The map that you see in front of you shows the speed with which popular uprisings against Jews then spread from city to city. You can see that within the space of about 2 months, the uprising spread from Seville in the south, upward north through Barcelona, and then doubled back west again to Navarre. In 1412, an ordinance on the enclosure of the Jews and the Moors was promulgated. It was designed specifically to restrict Jews and also Muslims' relationships with Christians. Among other things, the ordinance required Jews to wear a distinctive yellow garb and to live in ghettos that were kept locked at night. In the public sphere, Jews' prominence began to bring disastrous consequences. Samuel Halevi, who, as I mentioned earlier, was treasurer to King Peter I, the Castilian King Peter I, is a case in point. After very many years of service to the king, Halevi was tortured and then put to death because some people said that he was hiding a store of riches. And of course, in 1492, under the rule of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel, Jews who refused baptism were expelled from Spain. The history of people of Jewish ancestry who remained in Spain after 1492 is filled with examples of horrible violence and persecution. Jewish converts to Christianity were generally not truly accepted as part of what had become a monolithic culture. The late 15th century Libro de Alboraique presages this situation, depicting Jewish converts to Christianity. Next slide, please. In terms of a fabulous beast, with the mouth of a wolf, the face of a horse, the eyes of a man, the tail of a serpent, and the body of an ox. The converso, according to Alboraique, was a corrupt composite of many different creatures. These last illustrations of anti-Semitism in medieval Spanish culture, of course, echo eerily in the modern age. I've argued in a lot of my published work that tensions within the dominant ruling classes of medieval Spain, along with deep religious and philosophical objections to a pluralistic society on the part of elite thinkers, motivated the anti-Semitic behaviors that I've described. For many of these thinkers, the ideal was, as one commentator has put it, a unified realm under a single monarch responsible to guard alone. As I've said earlier, my expertise is in medieval Spain, but I think there's extensive evidence to indicate that these same themes were recycled in lettered writing leading up to the events of the Holocaust. But movements such as the expulsion of the Jews from Spain or the Holocaust in modern Europe were provoked as much, or perhaps even more, by the popular imagination than by the philosophies, convictions, and conflicts of the lettered elite. What I want to say is that the mass movements against Jews that link Mrs. Castillete's story with the story of her ancestors depend on a way of thinking promoted in the main by popular culture, at least as much as by philosophical reasoning. I want to reflect now on the role of popular culture, in particular popular imagery, in giving rise to violence and hostility against Jews. It was popular anti-Semitic images, I want to argue, that provided a shortcut, a much more immediate provocation than the reasoning of anti-Semitic philosophers, to the type of behavior that destroyed the Jewish communities of Spain and Salonika, and of course many others throughout the course of history. Let me begin by talking about one of the most striking images of the medieval world. This is the image of the Jewish baby born with his head on backwards. The deformed child is described by Alfonso X the Learned in his Cantigas de Santa Maria. The Cantigas is a collection of several hundred hymns and miracles of the Virgin Mary, which was written in the popular language, Galician Portuguese, during the mid-13th century. It was circulated very, very widely, and the images were well known by very many people in that century. The image is supposedly a graphic demonstration of Jews' error in refusing to accept Christianity. Alfonso's text reports that the baby's head is back to front as a consequence of his father's sworn declaration that the story of the virgin birth wasn't true. But the Jewish baby's portrayal, I would argue, had less to do with intellectual or religious debate than with, as I've said, the long-standing tradition of using highly stereotyped, negative images of Jews to provoke anti-Semitic feelings. Jews' supposed difference, which was documented so often in the literary portraits and miniatures of medieval Spain, gave reason to what I've described as that culture's increasing insistence on distinction and separation. Jews' devaluation, accomplished through representations that portrayed them as deformed, deviant, or diseased, legitimized, in the eyes of the dominant culture that surrounded them, violence against them, and eventually their expulsion. Next slide, please. The deformed baby is just one of a number of such deformed Jews depicted in Alfonso's miniature. I don't know how clearly you can see the slide, but you might notice in almost all of the slide the baby's father appears, also with stereotypical caricatured nose. He's wearing a stocking cap, which is a requisite sign of Jewish identity in medieval Spain, so no one would mistake his identity as a Jew. When the Jewish baby matures, you may notice in a later panel, his nose also is caricatured. Jews' portrayal in the miniature as deformed is accompanied by non-physical signs of deviance as well. The popular belief that Jews were often child murderers is, for example, folded into the Jew's image as physically misshapen in the fourth panel. The baby's father, who, as I've said, his nose is again strikingly visible, is here attempting to kill his son. While none of these images can possibly be said to have addressed Jewish religious belief, they cannot have failed to signify the various ways in which Jews were supposedly different. Collapsing Jewish character with deformity and deviance, they displaced any Jewish reality whatsoever, summoning up the superiority and dominance of the culture that surrounded them. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a sense that this image was repeated over and over again and had nothing whatsoever to do with any philosophical or religious argumentation or any real representation, true representation of Jewish religious belief. This panel, also widely known in medieval Spain, shows a group of Jewish men punishing a Jewish woman for transgression in a way that never would have happened. You can see they're pushing her off the side of a cliff. But again, the caricature is salient. I don't want to begin to speculate why Jews were scapegoated during the Middle Ages or afterwards, but I think that it's clear that representing them in these stereotyped ways justified in the eyes of their persecutors acts of violence against them. I said before that in Mrs. Castellette's song there's a certain consciousness of her medieval Spanish past and of its place in her own present circumstances. The medieval images I've shown you were used once again in her time, as I'm sure you've recognized, and of course also in intervening historical periods. It is indeed the medieval image of the Jew with a large nose and goatee that served as a bulwark of anti-Semitism in many arenas. Next slide, please. In 19th century England, the official police description and sketches of Jack the Ripper portrayed a man with a dark beard, dark eyes, and a large nose. The detective in charge of the case was certain that the sexually deviant butcher of prostitutes had to be Jewish. Next slide, please. As a result of this portrayal, most of the suspects arrested for the crimes were Jewish, although of course they later had to be acquitted, especially after the real Jack sent a rhyme to the police declaring, "I'm no Yid." You'll recognize, next slide please, you'll recognize in the popular German image of an unmanly, unsoldierly, and undesirable male, always represented with a prominent nose, large feet, and a diamond ring, a means of provoking anti-Semitic behaviors that intensified as Hitler came to power. Permutations of time and geography notwithstanding, what Mrs. Castellette's songs recognize as a particularizing of atrocity against Jews during World War II is in reality a manifestation of the same strategies that characterized the circumstances of her medieval ancestors. And yet there's an important difference which isn't well understood in the context of the Holocaust. And that is that Sephardic Jews continued for very many centuries following the expulsion in 1492 to recall the Spain of their ancestors, perpetuating, as I said at the start, the language and the culture of the very people who had sought to destroy them. There are many theories about this. My own is that the perpetuation of Spanish culture and language was not for Sephardic Jews a means of paying homage to the lands from which they were so violently banished, which is a popular, but in my view, wholly unsupportable sense of things. But that instead it was a means of keeping the past alive in a way that gave the Spanish Jews a sense of their own values and aspirations within new and quite often difficult circumstances. So the stereotyped images that were used to stimulate anti-Semitic sentiments and behaviors failed in Mrs. Castellette's time, as they did in the days of her ancestors, to destroy the Jewish people. Mrs. Castellette, for all the tragedy of which she speaks, could avail herself of a tradition that gave expressive meaning to a long history of survival. That this was a measure of comfort available to the progeny of Spanish Jews is not to be doubted. Ladino songs are rarely in tone these days, but in their latest incarnations, they were sung to children as lullabies. And I'd just like to end by playing one of them for you.
Vice Chancellor will entertain questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your voice.
There were two comments. The first is that a lot of this mythology is known, I think that's what you said, in the world because it was supported and sustained by the church. And as I tried to argue in my remarks, I think that there were many people, certainly in the late Middle Ages, who truly believed that there had to be one nation and it had to be organized under one religious heading, and that was the church at the time. That was a view. I think the question of the importance, maybe the essence, the essential Spanish culture being a Jewish culture because there were so many prominent Jews. Certainly there is a lot of evidence, and I've tried to present some of it this afternoon, that Jews were a very important, integral part of Spanish culture, and as I said in my remarks, even perhaps instrumental in the development of the Spanish language. Yes. The question is why did they hate the Jewish people so much? Well, you know, look, I mean, I think there was a lot of popular mythology that grew up around just a refusal of Jewish people to accept the church, and that was that was certainly seen as problematic in a culture that was moving in the direction of saying that in order to have a unified nation, you had to have a single religion. And Spain is not by far the only country in which that's been the case. Well, I think there are a lot of answers. I think I'm not really prepared to give a definitive answer because I think there are a lot of answers and a lot of reasons. And I think we see this replayed in a lot of circumstances. This was a text that was Alfonso X was a really spectacular king. And, of many great ironies, he was a king under whom Jews worked very, very well. And but what happened was that probably, he was the king and he commissioned people to both write the hymns and miracles, although maybe he wrote some of them, who knows, even all of them himself. But surely he had people working on the illuminations. And so what we see portrayed in the illuminations is a popular imagination. Now the question was how widely disseminated would these images have been, given that books were precious in those days. Actually, many, many copies were made of this book because Alfonso X was a very powerful king, was very proud of this. In fact, when he was buried, he asked to be buried with a copy of the book. And you can see a depiction of Alfonso the King lying in his coffin with his hands folded across that book.
About two more questions.
The question is, what's the future for the perpetuation of Ladino and Sephardic culture in the United States? I think not much, sad to say. Ladino is a language that is not spoken, by virtually anyone. I did a lot of field work, not recently, but some time ago I did a lot of field work. Many people did, going around with a tape recorder and trying to collect the last instances of people singing Ladino songs. And I have some really wonderful recordings. But the people I recorded from they could be 100 years old, and they're not alive anymore. People just don't sing songs anymore. I think there's been a revival, particularly in Israel, where there's a lot of interest, and there has been interest in a new compilation of a Ladino dictionary, and so it will be not a living culture, though.
I want you to please join me in thanking Dr. Mirrer for a wonderful lecture.
On behalf of the college community, and particularly our students, I am presenting Vice Chancellor Mirrer with a copy of Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize lecture. Like Morrison, Louise does language. And she shares her belief, as was evident today, that narrative is radical, capable of transforming and empowering lives. And the truth of this, as it is true of Louise, is that she is, by all of her many initiatives, making possible pedagogical paradigm shifts at Queensborough and throughout CUNY. We are indeed privileged to have her as our lecturer today and as our Vice Chancellor, Executive Vice Chancellor of the University.
You're welcome to join us in a reception outside. And again, if you want to get an announcement of next semester's lecture, please sign the book that is outside. Thank you.